At midnight, a little girl knocked and whispered, "Mama needs help." The Hell's Angel reacted, "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into tonight's tale. It was a cold and quiet night, the kind where the world seemed to be holding its breath. The clock on the wall struck midnight, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing by in the distance. The soft hum of a refrigerator and the distant rustling of wind against the trees were the only sounds that filled the air. Inside the small, dimly lit room, Jake Reaper Morrison, a seasoned Hell's Angel, was finishing a late-night repair on his bike. His hands were calloused, his mind focused, and his thoughts distant. The world outside seemed so far away, as though it couldn't touch him here in his sanctuary. He loved the quiet, but that peace was about to be shattered. There was a sharp, urgent knock on the door. 3 quick raps followed by a silence, so deep it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Jake froze, his tools falling from his lap onto the concrete floor. His instincts kicked in immediately. Who could be out there at this hour? His mind raced through possibilities. Could it be someone from his past, a rival club, or perhaps the law? Hesitant, he stood up and made his way to the door. He didn't ask who it was, didn't bother with any pleasantries. He just knew he had to open it. He swung the door open with a loud creak. Standing there, shivering in the cold night, was a little girl. She was no older than 6 or 7, her eyes wide with fear, her clothes ragged, and her hair matted with dirt. Her face was streaked with tears, and her lips trembled as she looked up at him, barely able to speak. "Mama needs help," she whispered, her voice cracking. Jake's heart sank. He was used to facing down danger, used to the rough and tough exterior that came with being a member of the Hell's Angels. But this was different. The innocence in her eyes, the desperation in her voice, hit him in a place he didn't know still existed. For a brief moment, he stood there, unsure of what to do. His biker instincts told him to be cautious, to stay distant. But he couldn't ignore the look in her eyes, the urgency in her words. Without another thought, he stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. "Come inside, kid," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "You're safe here." The little girl hesitated for a moment, looking back at the darkness behind her, but then she stepped inside, her tiny frame shaking from the cold. Jake closed the door gently behind her, the weight of the situation sinking in. "What's going on?" he asked, kneeling down to her level, trying to appear less intimidating. She looked up at him, eyes wide with fear. "They hurt her," she whispered. "She's really sick, and they're coming for us. They said they would make her pay." Jake's mind began to race. Who could have hurt a child like this? And what kind of people were after them? The questions piled up in his mind, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just let this little girl's words hang in the air. He had to do something. He stood up and grabbed his phone, dialing the number of a close friend from the club, someone he knew could help. But as he dialed, his thoughts were interrupted by the soft, hesitant voice of the girl. "Please," she whispered, "they're coming. You have to hurry." The cold dread that settled in Jake's chest turned into something else, a fierce determination. He would not let them harm her or her mother. Whatever it took, he would protect them. And for the first time in a long while, Jake realized something had shifted inside him. He wasn't just some biker anymore. He was something more. He was a protector. The girl's voice trembled as she looked up at Jake, her small hand clutching the hem of his jacket, her eyes wide with fear. "They're coming for us," she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. Jake's mind raced. What kind of people would hurt a child, threaten a mother, and leave this little girl at his doorstep in the middle of the night? He could feel the weight of the situation settling on him like a heavy burden. He had to act quickly. He glanced down at the girl, his heart aching for her. "Where is your mom?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the tension building in his chest. The girl didn't answer right away. She hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty as she looked around the room, almost as if she were waiting for something. "She's in the old house, the one on the edge of town," she finally said, her voice trembling. "They took her there." Jake's stomach tightened. The old house on the edge of town had been abandoned for years. It was the kind of place that nobody in their right mind would want to go near, a place where bad things could happen without anyone noticing. But he couldn't let fear stop him. Not now. Not when this little girl needed him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Stay here," he told her firmly. "I'm going to get your mom. I'll be back before you know it." The girl's eyes widened in fear. "But what if they come here? What if they hurt you?" she asked, her voice filled with panic. Jake kneeled down to her level, putting a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not afraid of them," he said, his voice low but full of resolve. "And I'm not going to let anything happen to you or your mom. I promise." He gave her a reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure if he could fully convince her. The truth was, he was scared. He had no idea what he was walking into. But there was no turning back now. He couldn't leave the girl alone. He grabbed his leather jacket from the chair by the door, quickly pulling it on, and then reached for his phone to make one last call. He dialed his club brother, the one person he knew could help him get the information he needed. It rang twice before someone picked up. "Jake," the voice on the other end said, a gravelly tone in the voice. "What's up?" Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need your help," he said, his words rushed. "There's a little girl here, and her mom's in trouble. I need to know everything about the old house on the edge of town." The voice on the other end was silent for a moment. Then, with a sigh, the person replied, "All right, I'll get the info. But you need to be careful. That place is crawling with trouble. You don't know who's watching it." Jake gritted his teeth. He didn't care who was watching. He had to save the girl's mother. "I don't care who's there," he said, his voice hard. "I'm going in. Give me the details, now." He hung up before the other person could respond, then turned to the girl. "I'll be back," he said, giving her a final look. "Stay here, don't let anyone in." She nodded, her eyes still full of fear, but there was a glimmer of hope in them now. He could see it. She believed him. He turned and walked out of the garage, the cool night air hitting his face as he stepped into the street. The sound of his boots hitting the pavement echoed in the empty street, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to match the pounding of his heart. He didn't look back as he climbed onto his bike, revving the engine to life. He had no time to waste. As he rode down the dark streets, the weight of what he was about to do pressed on him. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his mind focused only on the task ahead. He had to find this house, get to the mother, and get them both to safety. He was their only hope. The cold wind whipped against his face as he sped through the night, his bike tearing through the streets with a purpose. He didn't care about the danger. He didn't care about the past. All that mattered now was getting to the girl's mother before it was too late. The house loomed in the distance, a dark, menacing silhouette against the starless sky. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars. He knew this place. It was where the worst of the worst hung out. He had seen the kind of people who frequented this house, and he had a bad feeling about what he would find inside. But there was no turning back. He couldn't let the girl down. Not after everything she had been through. He approached the house slowly, his bike humming beneath him. The closer he got, the more uneasy he felt. The place was eerily quiet, the windows dark, as if it were waiting for something to happen. He stopped in front of the house and killed the engine, listening for any sounds, any movement inside. Everything was still. He stepped off his bike, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He pulled his leather jacket tight around him, then slowly made his way to the door. His heart pounded in his chest, his every step calculated. He had no idea what was inside, but he was ready for whatever came next. Jake approached the door with caution, his boots making soft thuds against the wooden steps as he slowly ascended. The night was unnervingly still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. He reached for the doorknob, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. There was a tension in the air, thick enough to be felt as a physical weight pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever might lie beyond this door. The last thing he wanted was to walk into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to protect that little girl and her mother. Slowly, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The creak of the door echoed in the silence like a warning. Inside, the house was dark, the only light coming from a dim bulb hanging in the corner. The air smelled stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he stepped inside, every move deliberate, every sense on high alert. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he was ready. "Hello," he called softly, his voice carrying through the empty space. There was no answer. He took another step forward, his eyes scanning the room, looking for any sign of movement. The house felt abandoned, cold, and lifeless. But Jake knew better than to trust appearances. He had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize the feeling of being watched. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he scanned the room, instinctively reaching for the knife strapped to his side. He moved further into the house, his boots scraping against the floor as he navigated through the dark hallway. At the end of the hall, a door was slightly ajar. He paused, his breath catching for a moment. He knew that door held the answers he was looking for. He reached for the door and pushed it open. Inside, he found her, Sara, the woman the little girl had spoken of. She was sitting on the floor, her hands bound with rope, her face bruised and battered. She looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice weak. "You have to help me. They're going to kill me." Jake's heart sank. He moved quickly, rushing to her side, cutting the ropes that bound her hands with his knife. The moment the rope fell away, Sara slumped against him, exhausted and trembling. Jake didn't have time for questions. He had to get her out of here. "Hold on," he said, his voice firm, though his mind was racing. "We're getting out of here." As he helped her to her feet, a sudden noise echoed from the hallway. A door slammed shut, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Jake's instincts kicked into overdrive. "We've got company," he muttered under his breath. He grabbed Sara by the arm, pulling her toward the back door. They had to get out before whoever was coming found them. As they moved quickly through the house, Jake's mind raced. He couldn't let anyone stop him now. Not after everything he had been through. He had made a promise to the little girl, and he wasn't going to break it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jake pushed Sara through the door and out into the cold night air. They were in the backyard now, surrounded by trees and thick brush. The house loomed behind them, dark and foreboding, but Jake wasn't stopping. He pulled Sara toward the woods, knowing they could lose themselves in the trees. But as they ran, Jake could hear voices shouting from inside the house. He didn't know how many people were in there, but he didn't want to find out. "This way," he urged, pulling Sara deeper into the woods. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stop. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Whoever was after them wasn't far behind. Jake pushed forward, his muscles straining as he forced himself and Sara to run faster. The forest was dense, the branches reaching out to snag at their clothes as they sprinted through the underbrush. Jake could feel the cold air burning in his lungs, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't, not with Sara depending on him. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the night, followed by a blinding flash of light. A shot rang out, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. The bullet whizzed past them, too close for comfort. Jake cursed under his breath. "Move," he shouted, pushing Sara ahead of him. They had to get to cover. They had to survive. As they ducked behind a large tree, Jake's heart was racing. He could hear the footsteps behind them, the sound of pursuit relentless. But he wasn't going to let them catch up. Not tonight. He pulled Sara closer to him, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to move. "Just stay quiet," he whispered, his voice low but steady. "We're almost out of this." But deep down, Jake knew that getting out of the woods was only the first step. The real battle was just beginning. Jake and Sara crouched behind the thick, gnarled tree, their breath coming in short, sharp bursts, mixing with the chilly night air. The sounds of footsteps and voices from behind them echoed through the forest, growing louder with every passing second. They were being hunted. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he knew they had no time to waste. The people chasing them weren't just looking for Sara and her mother. They were looking to silence them. He had to get Sara to safety, and fast. "We can't stay here," Jake whispered, his voice rough, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. "We need to move, now." Sara looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with fear, but also a flicker of trust. She nodded silently, clutching onto his jacket as he gently pulled her forward. Every step was calculated, each movement slow and deliberate. He didn't want to risk making a sound. They moved quietly through the thick underbrush, the forest around them so dense that the moonlight barely touched the ground. As they crept further into the woods, Jake's mind raced. He needed a plan, but the only thing he could think of was getting them away from here, far from the house and the men who were after them. His mind went back to the little girl's words and the terror in her eyes. They were in way too deep. There was no easy way out of this. He could hear the sounds of the search party growing closer. Footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves, hushed voices calling to each other in the distance. Jake could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his body working on pure instinct. His hand brushed the gun tucked into his waistband, making sure it was still secure. He hated the feeling of being armed, but in situations like this, there was no choice. They were in danger, and he had to be ready for anything. A sudden crack of a branch broke the silence, causing both Jake and Sara to freeze. The sound was loud enough to echo through the woods, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. He motioned for Sara to stay still, his finger pressed to his lips in a silent command. He listened carefully, trying to gauge how far the men were. The sound of voices grew louder, closer now. They were just moments away from finding them. Jake's mind raced. He had to make a decision. There was no way they could keep running without being caught. They needed to find cover, somewhere to hide until the search passed. He spotted a small clearing up ahead, the shadows from the trees creating a perfect hiding spot. It was a long shot, but it was the best chance they had. This way, he whispered urgently to Sara, pulling her towards the clearing. The footsteps behind them grew louder, and Jake's breath quickened. They weren't going to make it if they didn't move faster. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing, a figure appeared in the distance. A man, one of the men from the house. Jake's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he shoved Sara behind a large boulder, hiding her from view, and then dropped to one knee, pulling the gun from his waistband. He aimed it carefully, his breath steady despite the pounding of his heart. He wasn't going to take any chances. The man was still a few yards away, oblivious to Jake's presence. Jake held his breath, waiting for the perfect moment. The man stepped closer, his steps slow and deliberate. Jake's finger tightened around the trigger. And then, just as he was about to pull the trigger, the man stopped. A noise. Another searcher. Jake cursed under his breath. The distraction gave him the perfect opportunity. Without waiting for another second, he lunged forward, grabbing the man from behind and slamming him into the ground. The gun slipped from his hand as the two men struggled. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to subdue the man. It felt like time had stopped. Every muscle in his body screamed as he held the man down, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake pinned the man's arms to the ground, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. "Stay down," Jake growled, his voice low and threatening. The man beneath him grunted in response, but he didn't move. Jake didn't wait any longer. He picked up his gun, pointing it at the man's chest. "If you make a sound, if you move a muscle, I'll make sure you don't leave this place alive." The man's eyes widened in fear. Jake wasn't sure if he was bluffing, but it didn't matter. He couldn't afford to take chances. With a final warning, Jake backed away, still keeping the gun trained on the man. He motioned for Sara to stay where she was. They had to keep moving. Without another word, Jake grabbed Sara's hand and pulled her back into the darkness of the forest. The sound of footsteps had faded, but Jake knew they weren't out of danger yet. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the pressure building with every passing second. They had to move fast. They couldn't stop until they were far away from here. Jake didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to protect Sara and her mother, no matter the cost. Jake and Sara kept moving through the dense forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. The cold night air bit at their skin, but Jake barely noticed. His mind was focused entirely on getting Sara to safety. He could feel the weight of the gun in his hand, the cold metal comforting in its own way. He didn't know how long they had before the others caught up, but he couldn't afford to slow down. He glanced at Sara, who was keeping up, her small feet stumbling every now and then, but she didn't say a word. Her trust in him was clear, and that kept him going. "Stay close," Jake whispered to her, his voice low but steady. He didn't want to risk making any noise that could attract attention. As they moved deeper into the woods, Jake's mind was racing. What were they going to do when they got to safety? Where would they go next? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let anyone else hurt her. They had to get out of there. Ahead of them, the trees began to thin, and Jake saw the faint outline of a road through the gap in the branches. They were close, but as they approached the clearing, Jake stopped dead in his tracks. The sound of footsteps reached his ears again, this time much closer. His heart raced as he signaled for Sara to hide behind a thick tree. He crouched low, his gun raised, ready for whatever was coming. The footsteps grew louder, and Jake could see shadows moving in the distance. There were at least 3 of them, all wearing dark clothing, their faces hidden in the shadows. They were coming straight for the clearing where he and Sara were hiding. Jake held his breath, trying to stay as still as possible. The men were getting closer. His fingers tightened around the gun, but he knew he had to be patient. One wrong move, and they would be spotted. The men were now just a few feet away, their footsteps heavy on the forest floor. Jake could see the faint glint of metal as one of them carried a flashlight, scanning the area. His pulse quickened, but he stayed frozen, knowing that if he made a sound, it would be over. The flashlight beam swept over the trees, its light flickering and illuminating the shadows in a ghostly glow. It moved closer, inch by inch, and Jake held his breath, praying they wouldn't notice him. The light passed right by him, but it was too close. If they turned back around, they would see them. His heart pounded in his chest. Jake glanced at Sara, who was crouched low, her eyes wide with fear. He gave her a small nod, signaling that they needed to move. As the men continued past them, Jake waited for the perfect moment. The last man in the group was just a few steps away when Jake finally sprang into action. He grabbed the man by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him into a nearby tree. The man grunted in surprise, but before he could react, Jake had his gun pressed to his chest. "Don't move," Jake growled, his voice cold and deadly. The other 2 men turned around at the noise, their hands reaching for their own weapons. "You're making a big mistake, buddy," one of them sneered. But Jake didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto theirs, his jaw clenched in determination. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice low and controlled. "But if you make one wrong move, I will." The men hesitated, their eyes shifting nervously as they realized they were outgunned. Jake's grip tightened on the gun. He wasn't going to let them get any closer to Sara. The man he had pinned against the tree struggled for a moment, but Jake kept his hold firm. He wasn't going to give them the chance to escape. "Where is she?" Jake demanded, his voice rising. "Where's the woman you've been holding?" The man's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Jake thought he might try to run. But instead, he smirked. "You think you can just walk in here and take her?" he spat. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Jake's grip tightened, his patience wearing thin. He wasn't playing games. "I'll ask you again," he said, his voice colder than before. "Where is she?" The man glared at him, but after a long pause, he finally spoke. "She's in the warehouse," he muttered, his voice full of contempt. "But you won't get to her. Not alive, anyway." That was all Jake needed to hear. He shoved the man away from the tree, watching as he stumbled backward. Without a second thought, Jake turned and motioned for Sara to follow him. They were out of time. He couldn't waste another minute. They had to get to the warehouse, and they had to get there now. The man's threats echoed in his mind, but Jake pushed them aside. He wasn't afraid. Not now. Not with Sara depending on him. The 2 of them ran through the woods, moving as quickly as they could. The clearing was behind them, and the darkness of the forest seemed to close in around them, but Jake wasn't scared. He could see the faint outline of the warehouse ahead. They were so close. Just a little further. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the pounding of Jake's heart. He had no idea what awaited them inside that warehouse, but he wasn't turning back now. He couldn't. Jake and Sara reached the edge of the warehouse, the dark outline of the building looming before them like a silent sentinel. The night was still, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves and their own heavy breathing. They had made it this far, but Jake knew the hardest part was yet to come. As he scanned the area around them, his senses heightened. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. This was no longer just about getting Sara to safety. It was about facing whatever waited inside that building. Jake looked at Sara, her small face etched with fear, but also determination. She had been through so much already, and yet here she was, still holding on to hope. He couldn't let her down. "Stay close," Jake whispered, his voice steady despite the racing thoughts in his mind. He motioned for her to follow as he crept toward the entrance of the warehouse. The building was old, its metal walls rusted and covered in layers of grime. It looked abandoned, but Jake knew better. He could feel eyes on them, even if he couldn't see them. They were being watched, and it wasn't just the searchers from before. There was something darker lurking in the shadows, something far more dangerous. As they reached the door, Jake paused, listening carefully. He heard voices inside, muffled and low, but unmistakable. They were close. Too close. He pressed his ear to the cold metal of the door, trying to make out the conversation. "What if they don't come back?" one voice said, its tone filled with frustration. "Don't worry," another voice replied, rough and menacing. "They'll come. They always do. And when they do, we'll be ready for them." Jake's blood ran cold. They were talking about him, and they were ready. He had to act fast. He pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, motioning for Sara to follow. The room inside was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a flickering bulb in the far corner. The air was thick with dust, and the musty smell of mold and rust filled Jake's nostrils. He glanced around, his eyes quickly adjusting to the low light. There were crates and old furniture scattered around the room, and in the far corner, he could see two figures standing in front of a large metal door. One of them was a man, tall and imposing, his back turned to Jake. The other was a woman, her face hidden in the shadows. But what caught Jake's attention was the faint movement in the corner. He saw a pair of eyes watching him. It was Sara's mother. She was kneeling on the floor, her hands bound, her face pale and bruised. She looked up at Jake, her eyes wide with relief and fear. "Jake," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Get us out of here. They're going to kill me if they find out you're here." Jake's heart sank. He moved quickly, stepping closer to her, but as he did, one of the men turned, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "What the hell?" the man shouted, his hand reaching for the gun holstered at his side. "We've got company." The room erupted into chaos. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the man drew his weapon, but Jake was faster. He lunged forward, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it, forcing him to drop the gun. The man stumbled back, his face contorted in pain. Before he could recover, Jake delivered a sharp punch to his jaw, knocking him to the ground. The other man reacted immediately, reaching for his own weapon, but Jake was already on him. He ducked under the man's arm, delivering a swift elbow to his ribs before pushing him into the wall. The man groaned, trying to regain his footing, but Jake wasn't giving him the chance. He grabbed the man by the collar and slammed his head against the concrete, knocking him out cold. The fight was over in seconds. Jake took a deep breath, his body still tense, every muscle screaming from the exertion. He turned to Sara's mother, quickly untying her hands. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, urgent. She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm fine," she said softly, but Jake could see the fear still in her eyes. He knew they weren't out of danger yet. "We need to get out of here. Now." He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back door, where Sara was waiting. But as they made their way toward the exit, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Jake's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. "Hurry," he whispered, pushing them forward. They had to move fast. But just as they reached the door, the sound of more footsteps echoed in the hallway behind them. Jake turned, his hand gripping the gun at his side. He was ready to fight, but there was no time for that. They had to escape. With a final glance at the two men on the floor, Jake shoved the door open, his heart racing as he led Sara and her mother out into the cold night air. They weren't safe yet, but they were one step closer. The warehouse loomed behind them, dark and menacing, but Jake wasn't stopping. He pulled Sara and her mother toward the woods, where they could find cover. He knew they still had a long way to go before they were truly free, but for the first time that night, he felt a glimmer of hope. They could make it. They would make it. Jake and the two women kept running through the woods, the cold air biting at their faces as they made their way deeper into the trees. His heart was racing, his mind focused only on one thing, getting them out of there. The sounds of their footsteps were drowned out by the rush of blood in his ears, but he knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until they were safe. He glanced back at Sara and her mother, both of them struggling to keep up. He had to be strong for them. "Keep moving," Jake urged, his voice low but firm. The last thing they needed was for someone to hear them. They pushed forward, their bodies fighting against the exhaustion that was threatening to take over. The adrenaline had carried them this far, but Jake knew that it wouldn't last forever. They had to get out of the woods, and fast. But every time Jake thought they were getting closer to safety, something else happened. The crunch of footsteps behind them cut through the silence of the forest, and Jake froze. He motioned for them to stop, and they did, huddling together behind a thick patch of trees. Jake's hand instinctively went to his gun, but he knew he couldn't afford to use it unless absolutely necessary. They needed to stay hidden. The footsteps came closer. He could hear them now, the sound of boots crunching against the dry leaves. There were more than just a few people behind them. Jake counted at least 5. He turned to Sara and her mother, his eyes meeting theirs. "Stay down. Don't make a sound," he whispered. His heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low, every muscle tense, waiting for the right moment to act. The footsteps grew louder. They were getting closer. Jake's hand tightened on his gun, his grip steady as he prepared for what was to come. He had to keep them safe, no matter what. Just as the footsteps reached the edge of the trees, Jake made his move. He leaped from behind the cover of the trees, moving quickly and silently. The first man never saw it coming. Jake's fist collided with the man's face with a sickening thud, knocking him to the ground. The man let out a grunt of surprise and pain, but Jake didn't wait to see if he was out cold. He spun around, spotting another man approaching from behind. Jake tackled him, sending both of them tumbling to the ground. They fought in the dirt and the leaves, rolling over each other as the man tried to regain control. But Jake wasn't giving up. He fought with everything he had. With a final push, Jake managed to pin the man to the ground, his knee pressing into the man's chest as he held him down. "Stay down," Jake growled, his voice low and threatening. The man struggled beneath him, but Jake wasn't letting him go. He could hear the others moving around, their footsteps growing more frantic. They were running out of time. Jake looked over at Sara and her mother, both of them still crouched low, watching him with wide eyes. He needed to act fast. He couldn't waste any more time. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the phone he had taken from one of the men earlier. His fingers fumbled as he dialed the number of his closest contact in the club. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. "Jake?" The voice on the other end said, groggy but alert. "What's going on?" "I need backup," Jake said, his voice urgent. "We're in the woods near the old warehouse. There's a group after us, and I can't keep them off for much longer." There was a pause on the other end. "I'll get the crew," the voice said. "Hang tight. We're on our way." Jake let out a breath of relief. They weren't alone anymore. He hung up the phone and shoved it back into his pocket. He turned to Sara and her mother. "Help is on the way," he said, his voice steady. But deep down, Jake knew that it wouldn't be enough if they didn't move. The longer they stayed here, the more likely it was that they would be found. He helped Sara to her feet, keeping one eye on the other men as they struggled to get up. He needed to make sure they weren't followed. They moved quickly, weaving between the trees, trying to stay ahead of the search party. The woods were thick, but Jake knew the area well. He'd spent countless hours in forests like this before, running from the law, running from enemies, and sometimes just running from his own past. But tonight, he wasn't running anymore. This wasn't about him. It was about keeping Sara and her mother safe. He could hear the sounds of the men behind them, their voices growing louder as they searched the woods for any sign of movement. Jake pushed forward, his body screaming with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Suddenly, he heard the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance. Jake froze, listening carefully. It wasn't just one bike. There were several. Backup had arrived. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he realized they were about to be surrounded. But he couldn't stop now. He motioned for Sara and her mother to move faster. They were so close. The engine noise grew louder, and Jake's pulse quickened. They weren't far from safety now, but they still had a long way to go. He could feel the tension in the air as the backup crew pulled into position. The men chasing them would have no idea what was coming. Jake wasn't sure how they would get out of this, but for the first time in a long while, he had hope. They weren't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Jake and the 2 women continued running through the woods, the sound of motorcycle engines growing louder by the second. The backup crew had arrived, just as he had hoped. His heart pounded with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because help was here, but dread because the men who had been chasing them were still out there, and they weren't going to give up easily. The trees parted in front of them, revealing a small clearing. Jake scanned the area quickly, his eyes flicking back to the woods behind them. He could still hear the search party moving closer. The time to act was now. "This way," Jake urged, pulling Sara and her mother toward the edge of the clearing where the backup had parked. Several motorcycles were lined up, their engines still running, the riders waiting for Jake's signal. The crew was ready, but Jake knew that they couldn't afford to waste a moment. They were outnumbered and still far from safety. "Get on the bikes," Jake ordered, his voice low and firm. The women hesitated for a moment, but they knew they had no choice. Sara's mother moved first, her hands shaking as she climbed onto the back of one of the bikes. Jake helped Sara onto the bike behind him. The moment they were settled, Jake gave the signal. The engines roared to life, and the group sped off into the night. The forest blurred around them as they tore through the woods, the motorcycles weaving between trees and over rough terrain. The wind rushed past, stinging their faces, but Jake didn't care. They were moving faster than the men chasing them. At least for now, they had the advantage. Behind them, the sound of the search party's voices grew fainter, but Jake knew it wasn't over. They were too close to the warehouse, and the men wouldn't give up so easily. As they reached the edge of the woods, Jake looked back to make sure they hadn't been followed. The trees cleared and the open road appeared ahead, but there was still no sign of the pursuers. For the first time in hours, Jake allowed himself to relax, just a little. The sound of the bikes was the only thing he could hear now, and that gave him a sense of control. He needed that. "How are you doing back there?" Jake called to Sara, his voice tinged with concern. She didn't answer right away, but when she did, her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm okay," she said. "Just keep going." He could hear the exhaustion in her voice, but also the strength. This little girl had been through so much, and still, she kept fighting. Jake looked over at her mother, who was holding on tightly, her eyes closed against the cold wind. "We're almost there," Jake assured them. He pushed the bike faster, his mind focused on getting them to safety. The road ahead was open, but it wouldn't be for long. He knew they had to reach the safe house before the men caught up to them. The backup crew was still riding in formation behind them, but Jake could feel the pressure mounting. The further they went, the more exposed they became. "This is it," Jake muttered under his breath as they approached a small, unmarked building hidden at the side of the road. It was the safe house. It was the one place he knew they could lay low, at least for a while. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they were close. The bikes slowed as they pulled into the hidden driveway, the sound of their engines echoing through the quiet night. Jake didn't wait for the others. He jumped off his bike and rushed to the door of the safe house, unlocking it with a quick turn of the key. He motioned for the women to follow him. "Come on, we're safe for now," Jake said, his voice more confident than he felt. They moved quickly inside, closing the door behind them. The safe house was small but sturdy. It had been used for years by the club, a place to lay low when things got too heated. The lights flickered as they stepped inside, but Jake didn't mind. It was quiet, hidden, and that was all that mattered. "Sit down, get some rest," Jake instructed, taking a moment to check the windows and lock the door behind them. He couldn't afford to be careless now. He needed to make sure they were safe, really safe, before he let his guard down. As the women sat down, catching their breath, Jake's mind raced. He had kept them alive so far, but the battle wasn't over. The men who had been chasing them would be looking for them, and they wouldn't stop until they found them. Jake knew it wasn't just about keeping Sara and her mother safe. It was about finding a way to take down the people who had been pulling the strings behind all of this. But for now, they were safe, and that was enough. He sat down beside them, finally allowing himself to breathe a little easier. They had made it this far, and as long as they stuck together, Jake knew they would make it through whatever came next. Jake paced back and forth inside the safe house, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. He had done everything he could to get them to safety, but now the real work began. His mind raced as he thought about what to do next. The men who had been after them weren't just going to give up. He had seen the coldness in their eyes, the determination to finish what they had started. Jake couldn't afford to wait around and hope they would go away. He needed to act, and he needed to do it fast. He turned to Sara and her mother, both sitting silently on the small couch in the corner, their exhaustion evident in the way they slumped against each other. Sara's mother had finally managed to get some rest, but Jake knew it wouldn't last long. They had been through too much. Jake knew he had to keep them moving, keep them out of sight. As he walked past them, Sara's mother looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude and fear. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake stopped in his tracks, turning to face her. He met her gaze, his face hardening with resolve. "Now, we wait," he said, his voice low and steady. "We lay low for a while, let them think we're gone. and then we figure out our next move." She nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't know if they could keep running forever. Neither did he. But what choice did they have? "It won't be long before they come looking for us," Jake continued, his voice filled with certainty. "And when they do, we'll be ready." Sara's mother looked away, her face tight with worry. Jake hated seeing her like this, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. "Not now. How long can we stay here?" she asked her, voice trembling slightly. Jake's gaze flickered toward the windows, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape outside. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice grim. "But we can stay long enough to figure out what to do next. We'll wait until the backup comes through, and then we'll move again." He knew it wasn't the best plan, but it was all he had. He had to trust that the crew would show up soon and that they could get out of this mess. "I can't keep running," Sara's mother said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I can't keep looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to find us." Jake's heart tightened. He understood. He had spent his whole life looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the next fight, the next challenge. But this was different. He wasn't just running from enemies. He was running to protect the people who mattered. And that made all the difference. "You don't have to keep running," Jake said, his voice reassuring but firm. "Not as long as I'm here." He turned away, his eyes once again scanning the perimeter. He knew it was only a matter of time before they had to move again, but for now, they had a brief moment of peace. He just had to make sure they didn't waste it. As the hours passed, Jake remained on high alert, his senses sharp. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not when they were so close to safety. He checked the windows every few minutes, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement. It was quiet, too quiet. Jake knew that meant they were being watched. The calm before the storm. He had to be ready. Around dawn, a knock came at the door. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He grabbed his gun instinctively, his eyes narrowing as he approached the door. He didn't open it, just stood there, waiting, listening. Another knock, this time louder. "Jake?" A voice called, low and urgent. It was one of the backup crew. Jake's body relaxed slightly, but he didn't let his guard down completely. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice cold. "It's me," the voice said. "We've got your back. You're clear for now, but we need to move fast." Jake opened the door just enough to see the man standing outside, a member of the crew. "What's the situation?" Jake asked, stepping outside to meet him. "They're still looking for you," the crew member replied, his eyes scanning the area. "But we've got a safe route. You can get out of here, but you need to move now." Jake nodded, feeling a surge of relief. They weren't out of the woods yet, but this was the break they needed. "Sara," Jake called, turning to the women inside. "We're leaving. Time to go." He motioned for them to gather their things. Sara's mother stood up, her body still weak, but the spark of determination in her eyes made Jake feel like they had a real chance at survival. He knew they had to stay one step ahead. The crew member led them out the back door, through the yard, and into the woods once again. The cold air bit at their skin as they moved quickly, but Jake didn't care. The more distance they put between themselves and the men chasing them, the better. They had a safe route, and that was all that mattered right now. As they moved through the trees, Jake's thoughts raced. They were close, so close to being out of danger, but there was still so much left to do. He had promised to protect Sara and her mother, and he wasn't about to let them down now. They had made it this far, and they would keep going. Together, Jake, Sara, and her mother moved swiftly through the dense forest, following the backup crew. The cold night air stung their faces, but Jake barely noticed. His mind was focused solely on getting them out of danger. The sound of the forest, the crunch of their feet on the fallen leaves, and the distant hum of the motorcycles were the only things that filled the air. They couldn't afford to stop, not yet. The backup crew was leading them to an alternate safe house, a place that no one knew about. Jake trusted these men. He had known them for years, but the feeling of being on the run, always looking over his shoulder, was taking its toll. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the pressure to keep them all safe. They had made it this far, but there was still so much left to do. The forest began to thin, and in the distance, Jake could make out the faint outline of a building. They were close to the next stop. They needed to reach it without being spotted, without drawing attention. Every step, every move had to be calculated. Jake looked back at Sara and her mother, who were doing their best to keep up. Sara's mother was still weak, but she was determined, her face set with resolve. Sara, too, was holding on, despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. She had been through so much in such a short time, but she hadn't given up. Neither had Jake. They couldn't afford to. As they approached the safe house, the backup crew motioned for them to slow down. Jake signaled to Sara and her mother to stay close. They were almost there. Jake's heart beat faster as they neared the building. The safe house was just a small cabin tucked away in the woods, far from any major roads. It was isolated, perfect for laying low. But as they got closer, Jake's senses went on high alert. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something didn't feel right. He glanced at the backup crew, who were already checking the perimeter. Everything seemed normal, but Jake's gut told him otherwise. "We're going inside," Jake said quietly, keeping his voice steady. The crew nodded, and they began to move toward the cabin. Jake scanned the area one last time, his eyes darting back and forth between the trees and the building. They had to get inside quickly. The cabin door creaked as Jake pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the shadows creeping across the walls. The air inside was stale, the scent of dust and old wood hanging heavy. Jake motioned for Sara and her mother to sit down. "Stay here," he said softly. "I'll check things out." He walked through the cabin, checking the windows, securing the doors, and making sure there were no surprises. Everything seemed normal, but that nagging feeling in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. He went to the back of the cabin, where a small storage area was tucked away. He opened the door cautiously, his hand on the gun at his side, ready for anything. But there was nothing there. No signs of trouble. No one had been inside. For a brief moment, Jake allowed himself to relax. But it didn't last. A sudden noise outside made him freeze. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the forest floor. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He moved quickly to the window, peering through the blinds. He could see the shadows moving outside, the unmistakable shape of men approaching the cabin. They were here. They had found them. Jake cursed under his breath, his mind racing. He had hoped they would have more time, but it looked like they weren't going to get it. He turned back to Sara and her mother, who were still sitting in the small living room, unaware of the danger outside. "We need to move," Jake said urgently. "Now." The women stood up, their faces filled with confusion and fear. "What's going on?" Sara's mother asked, her voice trembling. "They're here," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "We have to leave. Now." Without another word, Jake grabbed their coats and pushed them toward the back door. They had to move quickly. The backup crew was already ready, their weapons in hand. But Jake knew they didn't have much time. The men outside weren't just looking for them. They were coming for blood. Jake's heart pounded as he motioned for the women to stay low. He opened the back door slowly, peeking outside to make sure no one was in view. The coast was clear. "For now, follow me," Jake whispered, leading them through the woods once more. The sound of footsteps in the distance grew louder, but Jake kept his pace steady. They had to stay ahead, stay hidden. Every move had to be deliberate, calculated. They couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The woods were dense, but the night was getting colder. The trees provided some cover, but they were also getting closer to the edge of the forest, where there would be less hiding. They had to make it to the road. The backup crew was already ahead of them, clearing the way. Jake's mind raced with every step. They were so close, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He felt the weight of the gun in his hand, the cool metal reminding him of the stakes. They had to keep moving, no matter what. They weren't out of danger yet, but they would be soon. The edge of the forest came into view, and Jake's pace quickened. They were almost there. They just had to make it to the road. A sudden noise broke through the silence. A crack of a branch. Jake froze, his heart racing. He motioned for the women to stay low, then crouched, waiting for the next move. He wasn't going to let them get caught now. Jake crouched low, his heart pounding in his chest as he listened for the sounds of movement behind them. The crack of a branch breaking underfoot had echoed through the forest, and now, in the heavy silence, every second felt like an eternity. He motioned for Sara and her mother to stay completely still, his eyes scanning the dark shadows between the trees. They couldn't afford to be seen. He held his breath, hoping the sounds wouldn't get any closer. The forest seemed unnaturally still, the only noise being the wind rustling through the leaves. Jake's senses were on high alert as he watched for any sign of movement. The noise had come from behind them, and it wasn't the kind of noise made by animals or the wind. Someone was out there, someone who had been following them. His grip tightened around the gun at his side. He wasn't sure how many people were out there, but he knew it couldn't be just one. It was too dangerous. Sara's mother was beside him, her face pale with fear, her eyes wide as she looked back toward the sound. She knew just as well as Jake that they couldn't let anyone get too close. Jake took a deep breath, staying low to the ground. His hand signaled the others to stay as silent as possible. They had made it this far. There was no way they could be caught now. If the men found them, it was over. Jake's mind raced through their options. They could try to make a run for it, but with the backup crew nowhere in sight, they'd be outnumbered and exposed. They could fight, but again, there was no guarantee of winning. The odds were not in their favor. They had to outsmart them, not outfight them. And that meant getting to the road without being spotted. Jake slowly rose to his feet, his movements precise, making no sound as he glanced back at the women. They were ready to move. They had no choice. He gave them the signal to follow, and began moving toward the edge of the woods, staying in the shadows and making his way toward the dirt path that would lead them to safety. The moment they made it to the road, the game would change. They'd have access to backup, they'd have a chance to get away. But it wasn't going to be easy. The men were closing in, and they were getting closer. As Jake crept forward, his eyes darted to the left and right, scanning for any sign of movement. He had a bad feeling, like they were walking into a trap. But there was no turning back now. They had to make it to the road. As they moved closer to the edge of the forest, Jake noticed a figure moving in the distance. It was one of the men from the group that had been chasing them. He was walking along the dirt road, his eyes scanning the trees as he slowly approached. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had to act fast. "Stay low," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. The three of them crouched down behind a large bush, waiting for the man to pass. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching longer than the last. The man was close now, too close. Jake's fingers tightened around the handle of the gun. If the man got any closer, they'd be caught. There was no way around it. Jake's mind worked quickly, calculating their next move. He had no choice but to take action. With one swift motion, he sprang into action, grabbing the man from behind and pulling him to the ground. The man barely had time to react before Jake slammed his fist into his face, knocking him out cold. The sound of his body hitting the ground was muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. Jake didn't waste any time. He grabbed the man's weapon, quickly stashing it away. He turned back to Sara and her mother, who were staring at him with wide eyes. "Go," he whispered, urging them to move. They didn't hesitate. The women scrambled to their feet and followed Jake, moving quickly toward the road. The sound of their footsteps was barely audible, but Jake could still hear the movement of the men behind them. He could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier by the second. They were running. Out of time. They were almost to the road when another figure appeared in front of them, blocking the way. It was one of the men from the group, his face twisted with anger as he brandished a weapon. Jake's heart raced. They had no choice now but to fight their way through. "Stay back," Jake growled, stepping in front of the women, ready for whatever was coming. The man raised his weapon, but before he could make a move, Jake lunged forward, delivering a swift blow to his chest, knocking the man backward. He stumbled, but Jake wasn't done. With a quick twist, Jake disarmed the man, sending the weapon flying from his hands. The man backed away, his eyes wide with fear. He wasn't ready for Jake's strength or speed. Jake didn't waste a second. He took the man down with one final punch to the face, leaving him lying on the ground, unconscious. "Go," Jake said again, his voice low and urgent. "We're almost there." Sara and her mother nodded, their eyes full of fear, but also a glimmer of hope. They were close to safety now. They ran the last few yards to the road, and as soon as they reached the pavement, Jake's eyes scanned for the backup crew. He spotted one of the riders in the distance, pulling up to them. The backup had arrived just in time. Jake's heart slowed for the first time that night. They were safe, for now. But Jake knew it wasn't over yet. There was still a long road ahead, and the fight wasn't finished. They couldn't stop. Not yet. Jake and the women reached the road just as the backup crew arrived. The familiar rumble of the motorcycles grew louder as the riders pulled up to them. Jake's heart finally started to slow as he saw familiar faces, the backup they had been waiting for. The crew wasn't huge, just enough to make sure they could get to safety without drawing too much attention. Jake gave a quick nod of recognition to the leader, a man named Mike, who had been part of the club for years. Mike understood the situation immediately and motioned for the others to keep watch. "You good?" Mike asked Jake as he approached, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "We've got them for now," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the area, making sure they weren't being followed. "But we need to move. They won't stop coming for us." "I know," Mike said, looking at the women. "We've got a safe house a few miles out. It's off the grid. No one knows about it." Jake felt a flicker of relief. The women had been through too much already, and he couldn't bear the thought of them being hunted again. "Let's go," Jake said firmly. Mike nodded, signaling to the other riders to fall in line. Jake climbed onto his bike, his hand firmly gripping the throttle. He glanced over his shoulder at Sara and her mother, who were now safely sitting behind two of the crew members. They had made it this far. They just needed to keep moving. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, with only the dim headlights of the bikes illuminating the way. Jake could feel the weight of the night bearing down on him, but he pushed it aside. They had to keep going, and that was all that mattered. As they rode, Jake's mind kept drifting back to the faces of the men who had been after them. He knew they were still out there, still looking for them. The fight wasn't over. The backup crew rode in formation around Jake, making sure no one was left behind. The wind whipped past them as they rode through the night, the only sound the hum of the engines and the occasional call of a distant animal. Despite the calm of the night, Jake's heart remained on edge. Every noise made him jump. Every shadow seemed like a threat. They had been running for what felt like days, and even though they had made it this far, Jake knew they couldn't rest yet. They had to keep their guard up. The road ahead twisted and turned, cutting through dense forests and across open fields. The further they went, the more isolated it became. The trees cleared as they approached a small hill, and Jake could see the outline of the safe house in the distance. It was a simple structure, tucked away at the end of a long dirt road. No one would find it unless they knew exactly where to look. As they approached the house, Jake's body finally began to relax. They had made it. The backup crew began to pull into the driveway, parking there. Bikes in a tight formation, their engines idling. Jake pulled into the small yard, his feet hitting the ground as he dismounted. He looked around, making sure they weren't being followed. Mike came over to him, his face serious. "You're sure it's safe?" Jake asked, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods. "It's as safe as it gets," Mike said. "We've got eyes on the road. No one's coming through here without us knowing." Jake nodded, his relief visible. He turned to Sara and her mother, who had dismounted from the bikes. Sara was still clutching her mother's hand, her face pale but determined. Jake knew she was scared, but he also knew that she trusted him now. That trust was everything. "You're safe now," Jake said, his voice gentle but firm. "For as long as we stay here, you're safe." Sara's mother gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't respond. He couldn't. There was too much at stake, too much he still had to figure out. He had promised them safety, but he wasn't sure how long they would have it. The men who were after them wouldn't stop. Not until they had what they wanted. "I'll go check the perimeter," Jake said, his eyes still scanning the horizon. Mike nodded and went with him, leaving Sara and her mother inside the house. The small cabin was simple, just a few rooms, but it would do for now. It was enough for them to rest, to plan their next move. Jake and Mike walked the perimeter, checking for any signs of disturbance, any hint that they might be followed. Everything seemed clear, but Jake wasn't going to take any chances. They had been lucky so far, but luck didn't last forever. As they walked, Mike turned to him. "What's the plan after this?" Mike asked, his voice low. "We can't keep running," Jake replied, his eyes narrowing. "We have to find out who's behind this. We can't keep protecting them if we don't know what we're up against." Mike nodded in agreement. "We'll figure it out. But for now, let's give them a moment to breathe." Jake looked back toward the cabin. Sara and her mother were sitting inside, resting for the first time in days. It was a fleeting moment of peace, but it was a moment they needed. "For now," Jake said, his voice filled with resolve. "We keep them safe, and then we take the fight to them." Jake stood by the window, looking out at the quiet woods surrounding the safe house. The stillness of the night was a deceptive calm. His mind was racing, thinking of the next steps, the risks, and the enemies they had yet to face. Despite the safety the cabin offered, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were just moments away from being found again. Sara and her mother were inside, resting, but Jake knew they couldn't stay in hiding forever. The weight of responsibility on his shoulders was heavier than he'd ever felt before. The fight was far from over. The men after them were relentless. He had learned that the hard way. It wasn't just some random threat anymore. It was personal. And Jake wasn't going to let them tear apart the fragile piece they had left. He needed to know who was pulling the strings, who had sent those men after Sara and her mother. They were too much of a target for just anyone to chase down. He knew there was a bigger force at play, one that would not stop until they had what they wanted. His thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the door opening behind him. Mike stepped in, his expression unreadable. "We've got news," Mike said, his voice low. Jake turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of news?" "The kind that makes you rethink everything," Mike replied, stepping further into the room. "We've been checking out the club's contacts, digging into the people behind all this. And it doesn't make sense, Jake. The men we've been dealing with aren't just some random hired guns. They've got connections. Real ones." Jake's chest tightened. He had known something didn't add up, but hearing Mike say it out loud made it real. "Who are they?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the higher-ups. The ones we thought we left behind," Mike said. "The club's old enemies. The ones we thought were out of the picture. It looks like they've come back with a vengeance, and they've got people on the inside. People who knew exactly where to find you." Jake clenched his fists. It was everything he feared. The past was catching up with him, and this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about Sara and her mother. He couldn't let them become collateral damage. "We have to hit back," Jake said, his voice firm. "We can't keep running from this." Mike nodded. "I agree. But we have to be careful. We're outnumbered, and we don't know how deep this goes. The last thing we want is to walk straight into another trap." Jake turned back to the window, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. He knew Mike was right. They had to be smart. Moving recklessly would get them all killed. But Jake couldn't sit back and do nothing. Not when the people he cared about were in danger. He'd already promised Sara and her mother safety, and he wasn't about to break that promise. "What's the plan?" Jake asked, his voice resolute. "We need to find out who they're working with. We need to hit them where it hurts. But we need to gather information first. There's a contact we can trust. They'll help us figure out who's behind this and how we can take them down." Mike looked over at the women, who were now standing in the doorway, listening. They had been silent for so long, but Jake could see the tension in their faces. They weren't as safe as they thought. "You're not just fighting for yourselves anymore," Mike said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "This is bigger than any of us. It's bigger than the club." Jake looked over at Sara and her mother, his heart heavy. They were still in shock, still trying to process everything that had happened. But they didn't have time to process. They didn't have time for anything but survival. He had to act now. "I'll go," Jake said, turning back to Mike. "We don't have time to wait. We move tonight." Mike met his gaze. "All right, but we do it carefully. No mistakes." Jake nodded. They had to move quickly and precisely. No more running. It was time to end this once and for all. He turned to the women. "Sara, your mother, stay here. We're not leaving until we have everything figured out. We'll make sure you're safe. Just stay inside." Sara nodded, her eyes filled with uncertainty but trust. She understood that Jake was doing everything he could. "I'm not going anywhere," Sara's mother said quietly. "I trust you." Jake nodded, and with that, he turned back to Mike, his mind already on the next steps. They couldn't waste time. They had to get to the bottom of this. The road ahead would be dangerous, but Jake was prepared to do whatever it took. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for them, the people who mattered, and nothing would stop him from seeing this through. As Jake and Mike stepped out into the night, the weight of what was coming settled in. They were walking straight into enemy territory, but there was no other choice. The past had finally caught up with them, and now, they would fight to finish what was started.